So somehow talking about Christ's return means that if that thief comes in the middle of the night, we should just let them.
We should be prepared
when it says,
for the Lord to show up in the middle of the night, and if it just happens to be a thief instead, we shouldn't resist.
So when you hear someone breaking down your door, are you supposed to say, "Is that you, Lord?"
Faith, firearms, and freedom. This is Armed Lutheran Radio.
Hey folks, welcome to another edition of Armed Lutheran Radio, a show about guns, hunting, competitive shooting, the natural right of self-defense, and what God's Word says about the issues surrounding gun rights and gun ownership. I'm your host, Lloyd Bailey, the Armed Lutheran, and this is episode number 334. Thank you so much for making Armed Lutheran Radio a part of your week again this week. For those of you who are new, welcome aboard, and I hope you enjoy what you hear, and we'll stick around for more, maybe even peruse our back catalog, 7 years worth of Armed Lutheran goodness for you to listen to. Joining us again this week, the pistol-packing padre himself, Pastor John Bennett. Pastor, welcome back.
Thank you. It's always a pleasure.
It is good to get together. Haven't, what was it, a couple of weeks ago at the online hangout that
yes,
which is always fun. And I would encourage you, if you are not a member of the Reformation Gun Club, you should sign up and come join us for our October hangout. Because those are they're a lot of fun to hang out with the cast and members of the gun club and shoot the breeze, talk about current events and all kinds of craziness. Speaking of which, I want to thank the members of the Reformation Gun Club for their support for making this episode and all of our episodes possible. I want to give a big shout out to Dan from South Lyon, Michigan, Richard from Wichita, Kansas, William from Bentonville, Arkansas, that's a little misleading. He is from Bentonville, but Lord knows where he's going to be when he shows up for our online hangouts. Paul from McKinney, Texas, right down the road from me. Rob from Green Bay, Wisconsin. Morris from Dallas, Texas. Edwin from Round Lake Beach, Illinois. Clear the throat there. Stephen B. and Richard from Pagosa Springs, Colorado. Thank you all for your support. If you would like to find out more about joining the Reformation Gun Club, about the hundreds of hours of exclusive content that you get access to as a member, and, of course, invitations to our monthly online hangouts, check out armedlutheran.us/gun club for all the details, or look for a link in the show notes for this or any of our previous episodes. All right, so today I thought we would talk about the midterm elections. With the elections are less than a month away, and we're going to talk a little bit about voting and how you can decide to vote for and for whom you should be voting, because there is a difference, and we'll explain that in a moment. I think we're 20, as of the release date for this show, we are 23 days away from Election Day. It's hard to believe.
I can't wait till it's over.
I know. If I see another Beto commercial, I am just going to vomit.
See, you've got to deal with Beto ads. We've been having ads for our just jackwagon of a candidate for our Attorney General up here. Mm-hmm. He's this radical Muslim. I can't even think of his name right now.
Is that Keith Ellison?
Yes, Keith Ellison. Thank you. And he is suing or taking Fleet Farm to court for supposed straw purchase violations.
What?
Yes, even though the ATF did a full investigation and said that they had done nothing wrong.
Well, of course.
Yes, because he's Keith Ellison. He's a commie.
Well, it's wall-to-wall Beto ads down here. If you watch any Daily Wire or any conservative content on YouTube, it is absolute wall-to-wall Beto ads. It makes me just want to barf. And the greatest one, and if you're not from Texas, you might not have seen this. You probably will not have seen this. There's this commercial that features a Texas couple who are supposedly happily married and yet lifelong Democrat and lifelong Republican in the same house. But they are, and the video starts out with a pickup truck pulling into the driveway and parking next to an SUV with a Beto sticker on it. And you see as the truck finally comes to rest, there's a Trump sticker on the back of the pickup truck. That is the most crumpled, awful-looking Trump sticker I've ever seen in my life. It looks like they dug it out of the garbage and they put it on with tape that you would use to pack Christmas presents. It is this guy cannot be a Trump supporter and do that.
Maybe they stole it off of somebody else's bumper.
Very possibly.
See, I could believe that maybe circa, 1985, 1995 even. In fact, my grandmother, her second husband, was a Democrat. And he thought Bill Clinton was this awesome guy.
Right.
Chances are, if he was still alive, and if he'd seen how crazy his party had gotten, that he would either be an independent or a Republican, because he was also a faithful, lifelong Lutheran. So.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He was one of that generation, like my parents and grandparents, who we have always voted Democrat, going back to FDR. It's just and they don't question. Only in recent years have some of my family members started to notice, this isn't Grandpa's Democrat Party.
Yeah.
Things are very different.
I'm not okay with murdering the unborn up until the moment of birth.
Right. I'm not okay with these 57 genders in my schools.
Yes.
Teaching it to my kindergartner.
I'm not okay with pumping children full of cross-sex hormones.
Right. Or mutilating them as a teenager, permanently disfiguring them. That's a bridge too far, I think, for Grandma. As it should be. Anyway, early voting is soon going to start. Would you believe that, according to Ballotpedia, I didn't know this, 16 states and 2 territories, according to ballotpedia.org, have already started voting as of the release date of this show. Some of them have been voting for 2 weeks.
I got my ballots, my wife and I, we got our ballots in the mail about 2 weeks ago.
Wow.
Yeah. We live in a precinct where they used to have in-person voting.
Oh, and you don't anymore?
Yeah, because it's such a small precinct, they just went to mail-in voting.
Oh, I see. Okay.
But we still take our ballots up to an official drop box location.
Right.
If it's the primary, we really don't bother. We'll just put them in the mail. But for the actual election, yeah.
Right. Gotcha. Well, early voting is going to be opening in 7 more states before the release of next week's episode 335. So with close to half the country already in or very near early voting, we thought we would talk about voting and how we consider it, how we recommend that you decide who to vote for and for whom to vote. It would seem an easy question. Vote for anyone who's not a Democrat, right?
In most cases.
Well, that gets back to the other, the earlier
in
point.
In some states, you don't have an option.
Yeah.
California does their jumbled primary, where it's not the top Republican and the top Democrat, but the top 2 vote getters in the primary that the race is between. So sometimes your choice is between what's the least terrible option between 2 Democrats.
Right.
And at one point, I would have said you could just write in Mickey Mouse instead, but now Mickey Mouse is trying to trans the kid, so I guess you can't vote for him.
Can't even vote for him anymore. So, yeah, and it used to be easier to sort of party line vote things, but you also now have squish Republicans, and you have, I know it's becoming a growing, or not a growing, a shrinking minority are the sort of moderate Democrats. It should never, though, be as easy as just, it should be. It should be as easy as voting straight ticket, or it should be that easy to differentiate. But it's so convoluted now. I think you've got to give it a little more effort, a little bit more thought in selecting your candidates, because especially when we're talking about these two most important, I think the most important issues. I know there are a lot of single issue voters, but I think for the right, especially, it has to boil down to two. It has to boil down to life and gun rights.
Yes. I would say, though, with this election, there's a third major issue, and that's the economy.
Right.
Usually, it's not often where we have this kind of economic turmoil leading up to an election.
True.
It's you might have it in off years, in between the general election and the midterm, but of course, as long as you got this rotting, fetid excuse of a human being, Joe Biden, in the White House,
yeah.
I just revealed to our entire audience my political alignment.
Oh no. They never would have guessed from the previous episodes.
The FBI might be knocking on my door after this is released. I don't know. But he is the worst president in American history.
I don't think that's even close.
Yeah, it's not. Obama was a close second up until about halfway through Biden's first year.
Yeah. But Biden is a combination of both incompetence and ideologue. But at the same time, I'm not sure how much he really believes any of the stuff that his administration's doing, and he's just sort of sitting back and letting the radicals that he's selected as his advisors kind of steer the ship.
Yeah, I have to wonder how often someone else is pulling the strings. I think it's at least 50%.
I can't imagine that he's making... I can't imagine him in like a cabinet meeting making any kind of cogent arguments for or against a policy position.
Yeah.
I just can't see it. I can see him agreeing, yes or no, maybe even disagreeing, but I can't see him making an argument and actually engaging in a debate that would guide policy. Now, I can see him trying to answer talking points in a political debate, that kind of thing. I can see him trying to do that. But if he's sitting down with his advisors and they're discussing, all right, what's the best way to do this? I can't imagine that he has a grasp of much of anything, or the ability to actually convey a message succinctly in a way that would convince anybody of his policy proposals. I just think it's rubber stamping whatever the favored leftist policy positions would be, whether it's climate change or whether it's assault weapon bans or whatever. I don't think that he can mentally, I don't think his faculties at this point allow him to make cogent arguments much.
Yeah. I imagine his staff meetings are basically sitting down saying to his room of sycophantic experts, or whatever you want to call them, okay, what do you guys think? All right, that sounds good. Let's do that. But it's...
Or he gives them a broad sort of, the very basic, we got to fight climate change. And they're like, okay, we'll go do that. And then they come up with the
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
I can't see him getting into the minutia.
No. In fact, there was a video from, I don't know if it was a few days ago or what. I think it was this week, of where he was in some sort of interview, and it shows him dropping his cheat sheet had a list of questions to ask and answers and all that kind of stuff.
Jake Tapper had to lean over and pick up and hand him his cheat sheet.
Yes.
From which he answered the question he was in the middle of answering, and he chose something that didn't actually fit the question he was answering.
But surprisingly, he's not even the least competent politician on the political stage right now.
No, gosh.
John Fetterman probably takes the cake for.
Well, Oz is not much better. At least he's got his faculties, but he is a joke of a candidate. Yeah, but I mean, compared to Fetterman, oh my gosh, he looks like a world-class statesman compared to him.
Yes.
So,
yeah.
Do you think that maybe Biden? Do you think Biden has a cheat sheet in his cabinet meetings? like when he's sitting down to talk policy, does he have cheat sheets like he does when he does it? I mean,
I wouldn't be surprised, because I mean, it's honestly, I don't think he's in control of his cabinet. I think that he's basically being told what to do. And the reason that they wanted this guy elected in the first place, they wanted him as the nominee, is because he is the most malleable.
Yes. Walk to the podium, take your seat.
Yes.
Yep. Just tell him where to go.
Don't sniff the little girl's hair in the third row.
Right. Avoid the Easter Bunny. Did you see that video?
Yeah, I think it was just Jen Psaki in a bunny outfit.
He looked like he'd seen the angel of death when he turned around. Oh my gosh. All right, so we kind of alluded to this earlier, and we've talked about this in past episodes, but who we vote for is the first point that we're to make. But there's also the question, as we've said in the past, and it bears repeating, this philosophy that we have espoused on the show, and we've talked about with a previous guest, this idea of voting for our neighbor. Can you kind of lay out that philosophy and how it works and how we should apply it in our decisions about voting?
Yeah, there are times where you'll have a candidate who seems rather, seems like they're not going to do anything that's going to harm your well-being. That They seem to be morally and politically neutral. Your standard milquetoast Mitch McConnell-like Republican.
Right.
Okay. But when it comes down to it, and sometimes you're not going to know what they are going to do until they are in office. There were a lot of people, myself included, that were incredibly skeptical about Donald Trump.
Yep.
I still think that he does not have the temperament to be president, because the way he runs his mouth it's not conducive to what a statesman ought to be.
Right, right.
But he governed like a conservative for the most part, with the exception of the fiscal side of things.
Right.
But voting for your neighbor is, how is this candidate's policies, sure, they're not going to affect me one way or the other, but how will their policies impact my neighbor? And I can give you a really good example of that.
Okay.
For myself, just our school district that we live in, 2 years ago, I think it was 2 years ago, they had a referendum. They've been trying to push this referendum through at least every year, if not twice a year, to build an entire new campus. And it had the whole 9 yards. It had, apple orchards. It had animal husbandry barns, all kinds of stuff.
Right.
$76 million.
Mm-hmm.
And that was going to be through property tax assessments. For myself, I could say, well, that seems really nice, a new school, sure. I don't own property, so that really doesn't affect me.
Right.
But how does that affect your neighbor?
Right.
Unfortunately, it passed by only 10 votes.
Ouch.
And they did it in the dead of winter when a lot of the elderly snowbirds were out of the area.
Nice.
Yeah.
Yep. Yeah, and I mean that's a situation too where even let's say you are a property owner, and well, or let's
I'll tell you
just
something
take
too.
your situation. That's a situation that benefits you without any cost. So
Well, not me, because we send our kids to Lutheran school. But
okay, let's.
But for someone who doesn't own property, and they send their kids to public school,
and the kids send their kids to public school,
Yeah.
it's a positive boon for them that the other taxpayers are paying for. It's a benefit that they're going to get. The question is, how does this financially affect your neighbor, right?
Right.
Okay.
And for the way that this was set up is that it affects farmers more than some person who just owns a single family home.
Oh.
And there are only 6,000 residents that live within the school district. $76 million bond.
Ouch.
For 6,000 some odd residents. But because they have open enrollment, they're hoping that they're going to get a lot of kids from outside the school district coming to their school.
And a shiny new school will attract those new kids.
It will. And so these taxpayers then are basically shelling out large sums of money over the next 20 years to pay for possibly children not even living in the school district to go to this fancy new school.
Ah, okay. All right.
So, but I think that kind of just puts to bed the whole idea of voting for your neighbor, that this has financially impacted farmers and many others in a very negative way.
Right.
It essentially takes, and they're betting on this, some grant from the state, which there's no guarantee of that grant. But at a minimum, it takes $2 million a year out of the local economy among approximately 6,000 residents, and I don't know how many households that is.
Gotcha. What's, off the top of your head, best example of this at the federal level?
At the federal level, I have a hard time really coming up with something off the top of my head. I guess the closest that I can get is, we talked about the Second Amendment, that for, the average person who doesn't own guns, well, that really doesn't affect me. So I really don't care one way or the other.
Right.
We think of, for example, these red flag laws, these laws of the universal background check, which essentially is you want to gift your firearm to a loved one. You didn't do a background check. Oh, we're going to have to put you in jail now.
Right.
So you have a really lax attitude about who to vote for and who's going to be supportive of that kind of a bill. And then the next thing you know, your neighbors are getting arrested for doing absolutely nothing wrong, only because the laws changed to more or less make your neighbor a criminal without having done anything criminally to begin with.
Right. Or I think maybe the most obvious example is the question of abortion.
Oh, sure.
Your unborn neighbor, right?
Sure.
How does this affect, and of course the women involved in these these abortions, and the families that are affected by these situations. So those are the neighbors that I think come into play when we're talking about that issue. And I think there are those in this country who I hear a lot of this, especially at places like when you're talking gun rights and you're talking with the general gun rights public. I think the idea of the single issue voter is something that's, I think, more common on the right. It's especially when you're talking about gun rights and abortion. I think for the left, the single issue is basically party affiliation. If you're a Democrat, they'll vote for you. It doesn't matter what you do.
Right. Even if you're basically a warm corpse like Fetterman.
Biden. Yep.
The fact that the polls are even close in that. Yeah, I don't like Dr. Oz myself because he's shown himself to be rather wishy-washy on things like transgendering children, and abortion and that sort of thing. But you look at the comparison, that's the thing that just... So Fetterman finally agreed to a debate 2 weeks before the election, even though early voting's starting now.
Right. Yep. That works out really well. So those who've already casted a vote, if they go and watch the debate and the debate changes their mind, it's too late. They've already... Right. So it just shows you on the left, especially if... I would assume on... I hate to make this always being beaten up on Democrats, but I would assume that any politician, because let's face it, politicians are for the most part scummy people, and if it would benefit them to hold a debate late because of some physical ailment or some questionable problem in their life that might affect the outcome of the election, they would probably like to delay that debate as long as possible. I can see that being done by someone on the right as well.
Right.
But I think, before we go further, what are your thoughts on third parties? Like, this seems to come up. We get a lot of talk about them when talking presidential elections. We don't seem to get much talk about them during midterms. Why do you think that is, and why do you think we're always stuck with this good choice or bad choice, worst choice situation that we seem to find ourselves in every election?
You know, the idea of a third-party candidate was really unheard of for the most part until you had, who was that guy back in the 90s?
Ross Perot.
Ross Perot, thank you.
Little hand grenade with a crew cut.
Yes. Yeah. And he, this guy ended up getting something like 20% of the vote in the general election.
Yeah. If
it hadn't been for Perot, George H.W. Bush would have had a second term.
Yep.
Possibly. Assuming that the people that were predominantly voting for Perot were, Republicans that felt disenfranchised because Bush was your typical establishment Republican.
Yeah.
So I'll give you an example, just from the 2020 election, that there were a few states where there was enough of a vote for the Libertarian that if those votes had instead been given to Trump, he would have won in that state.
Yeah, and that's...
I can't think of which... There was 2 states, and I can't think of it off the top of my head, but it could have been enough to sway the election. Now, when it comes to third-party candidates, in effect, they typically tend to just siphon votes away from one party or the other.
Yep.
They tend to take the moderate vote of, if they lean more towards the liberal side, but they're not totally bat crap crazy liberals, then they'll siphon off some of the Democrat vote. If they're more leaning Republican, but they're more liberal in some areas, then they might siphon off some of the Republican vote. So it just depends on the leanings of that third party candidate.
Yep.
But ultimately, And who knows, by the time Jesus comes back, I might be proven wrong. But a third-party candidate almost always ends up sabotaging the election.
Yeah, one candidate or the other, or being a complete non-factor like Joe Jorgensen was in 2020.
Yes.
Right. I think she the libertarian candidate.
Yes, that's right. I was trying to remember the name. Yeah. And didn't stand a snowball's chance in hell of winning a single electoral vote.
No.
But was there more or less as a spoiler.
And there were people, because she was willing to sort of say whatever it was positionally that would gain her votes. I had friends who were just typical, conservative Republican voters, pro-gun people who were all Joe Jorgensen. They were all about Joe because
Same here.
Because Trump had banned bump stocks.
Yep.
And Joe said in a speech that she supported the Second Amendment. Whether she did or not, it didn't matter. And my argument with them was, and I think I laid this out in a commentary at one point, was let's just imagine that she were to win. What could she possibly accomplish without a base of support in Congress to push her agenda forward? Let's say she is pro-gun as she claimed she was. Well, the House and Senate are controlled by Democrats. So it doesn't matter what proposals she puts forward. If they pass let's say, an assault weapons ban, they could then override any veto that she might put forward on any of their legislation. And it wouldn't matter what she was. She'd just be sitting there struggling to cobble together some sort of coalition. And more often than not, that would mean negotiating with and giving concessions to Democrats. And so it would be, unless the only way that I think a third party candidate becomes viable at the national level, at the presidential level, is if you build some sort of a, grassroots organization underneath that adds congressmen and senators who will be of the same party, of the same platform, and will help move that candidate's priorities forward in Congress. Otherwise, they're just, even in the off chance that they might win, they wouldn't be useful as president.
Right.
So let's get into those two. Let's get to those two issues that we've been talking about, the gun issue and the abortion issue. We've talked about both extensively, and we've talked about how the abortion issue is, the pro-life issue is a pro-gun and pro-life are compatible with one another. These are the two issues, I think, on both sides of the aisle that seem to stir up people's passions and emotions, regardless of what the economy is doing. They get kind of to the core of our identity as a nation, that idea of, personal liberty and the right to life and liberty in the pursuit of happiness, that stuff. For the left, it's about bodily autonomy and how can they pursue life and happiness if you're not safe from gun violence? For the right, how can you pursue life if it's legal to end it in the womb? And how can you pursue life and liberty and happiness if you're not permitted by the government to defend yourself? So I think, and jump in and correct me here if you think this is the wrong approach, I think we have to be two issue voters. That we can't settle on, although I think one of the two is primary, but I think those two are really the key issues that should drive us in terms of voting. Right?
Yeah. Yeah. And it's, how do I phrase this? Just about every person who's pro-gun is most likely pro-life. The converse isn't true, though. there are a number of pro-life Democrats. There's pro-life atheists. It's they're not generally, pro-gun. For me, as a Christian, I uphold the right to life as primary.
Right.
If I have a candidate who's very strong on life issues, but they say, yeah, I would be okay with red flag laws, I would be more inclined to vote for them over the candidate that was pro Second Amendment through and through, but was shaky on abortion.
I'm glad you brought that up, because I had kind of outlined, I want to throw some hypotheticals at you and get your thoughts here. So there's this chart. I think that we could draw a chart basically that would help you decide which candidates you should vote for and why. And let's say, first hypothetical, let's say both candidates are pro-life. Then how do you distinguish then between which of the two to vote for?
If they're both pro-life,
I know that's a long shot because we're talking about one of them being a Democrat. So
right.
So we are talking hypotheticals here.
And I think that's a question that would come up more in something like a primary election, but with the regular election, whether it's midterm, whether it's general, whatever it is, if you have two that are both pro-life, and if you compare them side by side, there's no difference between the two, then that's when you begin to look at other issues like the Second Amendment. Okay, what happens if they're both Second Amendment?
Yeah.
Okay, how do they feel about traditional marriage? How do they feel about the push to trans the kids? So think of it like a flow chart.
Right.
Okay, they're both pro-life. Move on to the next thing. They're both pro-gun. Okay. So work your way through and see which politicians' positions line up with what is biblically acceptable.
Right. So if either of those two candidates is pro-choice, if one of them is pro-life and the other is pro-choice, the answer is obvious and clear which of the two you should prefer, because I don't care if they support gun rights, and I don't care if they get an A rating from the NRA. If they are pro-choice, that's a problem.
Yeah.
Above all else.
And when it comes to the NRA and their A rating, I call foul on that, just because there are so many times that I've seen, even for within the state of Minnesota, they'll give a Democrat an A rating on gun rights, but darn well that Democrat is most likely going to vote lockstep with the Democrat Party if gun rights comes up on the table.
That's another thing. Yeah, that's a good point. Because let's say they're both pro-life and you get down to the gun issue and the Democrat happens to be the more pro-gun of the two. Now you've got a dilemma, because you know that electing a pro-gun Democrat is only going to give people like Nancy Pelosi, who are not pro-gun and who are extremely anti-life, more power by giving them another seat in Congress. Right.
Because, and you have to also think, how are they going to vote on other issues? And for many people right now, the economy is right up there in the top 3 issues.
Right.
With the majority of voters. So, this candidate, okay, they're pro-life, they're pro-gun, they're pro-family, but this one is pro-big spending, even if they're a Republican. Mm-hmm. And so it's, yeah.
Once you get down past those first two, it gets tricky. It gets murky.
It does.
Now, what if they're both pro-life And what if, well, no, what if they're both pro-choice?
Oh, sorry.
Bless you.
Ooh, I was finishing up my last bit of whiskey and it went down the wrong pipe.
Oh dear.
Oh,
That's a waste of whiskey.
yeah. Oh, another 1,000 years in purgatory for that.
Oh dear. So what if both the candidates, I know this is a huge stretch, but let's say both candidates are pro-choice and they're both pro-gun. I know it's a stretch, but let's play that out. What if you have two pro-choice candidates? Do you simply abstain from voting, or is there a way to discern between them?
Yeah, that's a very difficult choice. And in that instance, I would take a look, because I believe that you have a duty to vote your conscience.
Mm-hmm.
And so you take a look at these candidates and differentiate between the two of which is going to do the greater amount of harm, and then vote for the other guy. I guess you could call it the lesser of two evils argument. And in that instance, if you are so torn on these candidates and you just can't vote for them because they're both pro-life,
pro-choice,
pro-choice, that's when you say, okay, maybe I go third party, maybe I abstain.
Maybe I just skip this race and look down ballot.
Yeah. I can't see myself voting for somebody who is pro-choice.
What if you've got two pro-gun candidates? I know this is getting really hypothetical now, but these are challenging questions that we should have to kind of think through, because who knows, they might come up somewhere. And like you said, local elections, the smaller state and local elections, you're more likely to get into these differences. What if you've got two pro-gun candidates that are pro-choice, but one actually is in favor of some measure, some amount of restrictions, and the other is not, or they have differing views on how abortion should be regulated and restricted?
You know, if I had a candidate who looked good on every other issue, but on the issue of life, they believed in the practice of maintaining the legality of abortion, but with restrictions, I would possibly vote for that candidate just on the basis of, okay, I guess some restrictions are better than no restrictions.
Right. It's kind of the Reagan.
I would probably need to take a shower after voting for that person.
Yeah. But it's also,
I feel dirty just thinking about it.
It's also sort of that Reagan approach, right? Where you're like, okay, we can't get everything we want right now, but if we could get some of it, if we could get, let's say, a heartbeat bill, or if we could get a only for rape or incest bill, that would certainly be preferable to a unlimited abortion right up to the day of birth.
Right.
So you could take that approach to it. And again, like you said, it's a matter of each person examining their conscience and trying to figure out what they're comfortable with. So don't take this as us telling you what you have to do or how you have to vote. We're just kind of working through the ideas of the considerations that you as a Christian may find yourself facing when it comes to these two issues. Because it's not as clean cut as just, okay, he's pro-gun, I'm voting for that guy. Wait a minute.
Right.
And that's, you mentioned earlier that most pro-gun people are pro-life, but there is a large percentage of the pro-gun community who are unfortunately not Christian and not pro-life. There is a large percentage, and there are a number of I don't know what the percentages are, so I should be more careful about saying large percentage. There's a large number.
I would say that the number of people who are pro-gun and who are not pro-life is smaller than the number of people who are pro-life and are not pro-gun. Does that make sense?
Smaller than... Yes.
So the number of people that... Okay.
Yes, it does. Okay, I had to think that through for a second.
Sure.
It's the vodka. Slowing down the brain cells.
Your mental lubricant is wearing out, huh?
Yes. I need, or it's kicking in, one or the other. I'm not sure. Maybe a bit of both. So you can, I think we can, in good conscience, and again, it's up to each individual person, but I think we can, in good conscience, vote for, with a shower afterward, vote for a pro-choice candidate, so long as that candidate would advance the ball in terms of moving us towards greater restrictions on abortion. If your choice is the person who supports that, the notion that you can, the Ralph Northam idea that you can kill them the day they're born, and you've got someone who says, well, no, I would prefer that we ban it after there's a heartbeat.
Right.
I think that's a clear choice. Now, if you decide that no, they're both pro-choice, I can't vote for either one of them, I totally understand that. But I think you can, with a good conscience, make that distinction. There are some nuances to this. And I think in the interest of protecting more lives, voting to defeat the candidate who's in favor of killing as many as possible right up to the day of birth is probably the better choice.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
Now, crime is a major issue this year. With all of the rising crime in our major cities. I don't know whether you noticed there was an article that came out in Breitbart this week that was talking about how, and I followed it up on some other articles, talking about how the uniform crime report from the FBI is incomplete because the FBI changed its system of reporting.
Imagine that.
Well, they switched from one that was sort of a general summary report to something that's more specific. They wanted... Oh,
really? Okay.
Yeah, so I think this is a good...
they're actually doing something beneficial.
Yes, I think so. And they're trying to get more specific information about the offenders and the types of crimes that are being reported. And they've spent, apparently, millions and millions of dollars over several years trying to get transition towards this. 7,000 of the 18,000 law enforcement agencies in this country did not report anything last year.
Really?
Nothing.
Wow.
So, and that includes Los Angeles and New York, the state of Florida, and somewhere else. I mean, like major metropolitan areas did not report.
That's surprising the state of Florida didn't report.
I know. It is strange. And I don't know whether it was just they couldn't, I don't know whether they didn't send any information at all or whether they didn't get enough specificity in their reporting and they just didn't.
Or being that it's Florida, did they say, we're not going to comply with this because it puts an undue financial burden on the state?
That's also possible.
Yeah.
Now, that's
for places like California and New York, or not California, Los Angeles and New York. I would be inclined to think that it was because they didn't want to show how bad it had gotten in their jurisdictions.
Oh, I'm guarantee you that. Yeah, you're probably exactly right on that.
In fact, they're saying that the state of New York may elect a Republican governor over the issue of crime itself.
Yeah, on that alone.
The fact that that's now within the margin of error for a competitive race in New York.
Yeah. Yeah. So I know why though is crime, the question of crime not an issue on which, not one of the primary issues, or even let's say say the economy. Why are those kinds of issues? Why are those not primary? Because the economy affects everyone. It affects all of our neighbors. Crime is affecting large swaths of the country, our neighbors, especially in the inner cities and places like New York and Los Angeles and large cities like this. Why are those issues I don't think that those should be our primary concern in any election. They are important, but they're secondary to these other concerns. Why would you agree with that? And if so, or if not, why?
I don't know if I would agree with it, but I don't know if I would disagree with it. I don't know if that's terribly helpful.
I think it's one of those ladder rungs, like you were talking about. Like, okay, in the flow chart where you check these two boxes and move down.
Right. And I think part of it has to do with the media, to be honest, because the as much as these issues are played out in the media, so often the blame is placed in places other than where it belongs.
Oh, yeah.
How much of the economy is the media trying to push off on being Trump's fault?
Or Putin.
Or Putin, yes. The Putin price hike.
Right.
You know?
God, how many times did we hear that? You hear of these liberal Democrats blaming Putin for the increase in the price of gas, even though Biden, within the first month of being in office, took steps that cut our domestic exploration by a third. Yes. And is now going hat in hand to our geopolitical enemies begging for oil.
That's the funniest thing with Saudi Arabia.
I know.
He goes over there and says, well, you're going to cut production by 1 million barrels a day. Can you maybe boost it up a little bit and help us out?
Like,
and the next thing you know, we're cutting by 2 million barrels a day. So take that.
Yep.
Yeah. The only reason that gas is not $5 plus a gallon right now is because he's been emptying the strategic oil reserves, which we are royally screwed
if war
breaks out.
Yep. Yep. Where'd that go? Oh, yeah. We did that trying to...
Might be time to start learning to speak Chinese at this point.
Yep. And sometimes when you're talking about the crime issue, sometimes the crime and the gun issue run headlong into each other because the candidate's solution to crime may be gun control, as it is in the case of Joe Biden.
Right.
Or bail reform, or like that Frankenstein monster in Pennsylvania we were talking about earlier, who wants to release people from prison to give them a second chance.
This guy can't even string together one single coherent sentence. And how does he have close to 50% support right now?
Because
boggles the mind.
Simply because he's a Democrat.
Yep.
That's all it is. Now, the reason that we focus so heavily on gun rights and abortion is, I think, not apart from the moral issues, they tell you. And the reason that you should focus on those two first, I think, is because I think they tell us much more about a candidate's character and their view of the relationship between government and citizen. Right. So on the question of gun rights, if they're anti-gun, clearly they don't trust you and they think the government knows best. If they're pro-gun, that tells you that they trust you as a citizen to make responsible decisions. So that gives you an insight into their character. If they're pro-life, it tells you that they are a good and moral person. Whether they're a Christian or not, it doesn't matter. It tells you that they place value on human life and will fight to protect it. If they're pro-choice, it tells you the exact opposite.
Right.
That their sense of morality is somehow based on self and personal gratification and convenience and that sort of stuff over the importance of human life. So it's a tricky, it would be an interesting flowchart to try to draw out. It would get really messy. I don't think we could do it on a single 8 by 10 or 8.5 by 11 piece of paper. You would have to have, I think, a big poster board to flowchart the decision process. But I think, without getting too far into the details, I think if you start with those two issues, if you start with life and gun rights and work your way down from there, if all things are equal, once you get through those two issues, then you work your way down through crime and economy and the other stuff to figure it out. But in most cases, I think you're going to be able to figure out probably in those first two.
I would imagine. And it's ultimately those two issues also work hand in hand, as we have discussed before, that it's, the Second Amendment, gun issues, gun rights issues, and those sort of things. It's about the right to protect life.
Yep.
Abortion issues, pro-life issues, that's about protecting life within the womb. Gun rights issues are about protecting life outside of the womb.
Right. Yep, absolutely. All right. Any last thoughts before we send everyone to the polls?
Well, if you've disagreed with anything that we've said here, send us some comments and we can use that in a future episode.
That's right.
But it's the option of not voting, I don't think is ever a good option. Unless you're in a place like California and you have two terrible Democrats to choose between.
Right. And
then, I said you can't write a Mickey Mouse anymore, but you can write in Yosemite Sam. We know he's pro-gun.
Right, exactly.
But, and that's when you have to consider, okay, I know I'm kind of throwing my vote away, but I'm going to vote for a third-party candidate who aligns with the issues that I believe strongly about.
Right. So you don't have to take a shower afterwards.
Right. You're still throwing your vote away, but at least you can do so with a clean conscience.
Right. I don't feel icky after doing it.
Yes.
I've wasted my vote, but at least I can do so with a clean conscience. And without
Amen.
Large amounts of alcohol. All right.
Yes.
Well, folks, if you have any questions, any comments about anything you heard here today, we would love to hear from you. Visit our feedback page at armedlutheran.us/feedback. You can leave us a voicemail or a voice message or send us an email. We would love to hear from you and respond to you in a future episode. What's coming up? What is coming up? I think I announced last week that we're doing an online hangout, and I think that's going to be when did I announce that? I think that's coming up this week.
This week?
I believe it is. I can't remember what I said. I think the online hangout is coming up this Wednesday, the 18th. Is that right? I believe that's the correct date. So come hang out with us for the online hangout on the 18th at 8:30. And if you're not a member of the Reformation Gun Club, be sure to sign up at armedlutheran.us/gun club. And you can join for as little as $15.17 per year and come hang out with me and Pastor Bennett and a bunch of other really cool folks once a month for our online hangouts. Pastor, thank you so much for hanging out today and doing this.
Absolutely.
And folks, we will talk to you next week for episode 335. I did. Keep shooting, keep praying. We'll talk to you next time. Okay, yeah, the mental lubricant is not helping me.
For show notes, be sure to visit our website at www.armedlutheran.us. Check out the Facebook page, The Armed Lutheran, or join our Facebook group, Fans of Armed Lutheran Radio. If you like what you hear, please leave us a comment on our feedback page at armedlutheran.us/feedback or a review on iTunes and let us know what you think. Thank you for listening to Armed Lutheran Radio, a member of the Self-Defense Radio Network.